Hi, Karen. How are you?
I'm doing great, thank you.
Great.
We get an echo if we do it twice. All right, gonna let everybody in. We are live on YouTube. Good evening, everyone. If you're just joining us, this is the Renters Alliance Renter Town Hall. Takes a couple of minutes to get everybody on board, but welcome everybody. We'll get started in just a few minutes. If you're just joining us, this is the Renters Alliance Renter Town Hall. It takes a couple of minutes to let people in on Zoom. Welcome everybody who's joining us. We usually wait until we hit a magic number. I haven't decided what that is yet. We'll give it one more minute and we'll get started. Again, if you're just joining us, this is the Renters Alliance Renter Town Hall. We'll get started shortly. Here at Renter Central. Okay, let's begin. Good evening, everyone. My name is Matt Losack. I'm the co-founder and executive director of the Montgomery County Renters Alliance. We have the honor and pleasure of having our Attorney General here with us tonight for a discussion on his office and what he's doing to support renters. We will also have later in our program a discussion with Councilmember Andrew Friedson, who is the lead co-sponsor of the anti-rent gouging bill, as it's so called, as part of our ongoing discussion on rent stabilization and rising rents in Montgomery County. A couple of things. For those who are attending, we would like you to put your questions or concerns in the chat. We will get to your questions and concerns in each part of the town hall tonight, whether your question or concern is for the Attorney General or your question and concern is for the later part of the program with Councilmember Andrew Friedson. And then after we have both of those discussions, if there's time, then of course we will take any questions or concerns any renter has about their issues in their apartment community. And if we don't have time for that, then we would ask that you email us at info@Renters Alliance, and we will follow up as we always do. Let me quickly introduce who we have on this panel, who are not the VIPs, but just our regular folks. First of all, my staff, that is David Mullins, who will be answering questions of concern, Pat Beckham, and Malek Demir. David is also fluent in Spanish, and if there's anyone who has any need for Spanish translation, David can help in the chat. And I'm especially honored and careful because I have three of my board members on this call. And first of all, our treasurer, Joshua Fisher, who makes sure that we do things according to what the bylaws say and how we spend our money correctly, right, Attorney General?
That's right.
And our vice chair of our board, Chris Perry, who is also a veteran. And of course, the chair of our board, William Roberts. And Attorney General, Mr. Roberts, our chair, will introduce you. And then if you care to introduce your colleague, Karen Strawn, when it's your turn to speak, then please do so. So with that, William Roberts.
Well, thanks, Matt, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for being with us. Attorney General Brown, we're excited to have you. I like calling this gathering Renter Central, Matt. We might have to hashtag that and use it, since this is sort of the central time and meet and touch point that lots of folks come to hear about what's going on with renters in Montgomery County. As Matt said, my name is Will Roberts, proud to be the chair of the Montgomery County Renters Alliance. Thanks for being with us. For those who are with us perhaps for the first time and aren't still familiar with us, want to let you know that we were formed back in 2010, and the Renters Alliance is the first and only regional nonprofit that is dedicated exclusively to tenant outreach, organizing, advocacy, and education. We've got a full program, as Matt laid out tonight, and really interested and excited about the discussion we're going to have. But let me just say a couple of things before we hop in. The context of which we continue to meet here in this virtual space is that we continue to see rents that are skyrocketing around our communities, around the county, and around the state, into the double digits. We have described it as what amounts, unfortunately, to forced migration of working and low-income families, those who are on fixed incomes, those who have those fixed housing costs that are really moving beyond their reach. According to a recent Princeton study from the Eviction Project there, Maryland has actually become the top eviction filing state in the nation. And so we've got some work to do. And tonight, we're going to offer again an opportunity to for renters, for the public, to hear from some of the senior elected officials who are tasked with and working on some renter protection policies, to offer their thoughts and share some of the work that's going on. First, we're really excited, as Matt said, to hear from our Attorney General, followed by another part of the public dialogue on rent stabilization going on here in Montgomery County. You'll recall that we've had the various council members, Natalie Fanny Gonzalez, Will Jawando, and tonight hearing from Andrew Friedson, discuss the two bills before the council, the Home Act, which Councilmember Jawando and Mink are sponsors of, and the anti-rent gouging bill that council members Fanny Gonzalez and Friedson are sponsoring. So that's going to be a lively and informative discussion. But first, really excited to hear from our Attorney General, and a person whose credits and work championing progressive public policies and things near and dear to our heart are like too numerous for me to list off. But let me just give you a couple as is appropriate. So Attorney General Brown is our state's 47th Attorney General, and we're really proud to say he's our first African-American Attorney General in the state's history. He represented the 4th Congressional District in Congress from 2017 to 2023, served as Lieutenant Governor from 2007 to 2015. I think that's when I first met you, Attorney General Brown, when you were LG, and served before that in the House of Delegates as Vice Chairman of the Judiciary Committee and Majority Whip from 1999 to 2007. So there's a long history in the state at all levels of government on lots of issues, including renter and tenants issues. Has been a leading voice really nationally on equity and justice matters from the time serving in the General Assembly all the way up through Congress, and now in his role as Attorney General, leading on things like the repeal of the death penalty, decriminalization of marijuana, lots of progressive and transformative criminal justice reform policies, and has really been a champion and leading voice on common sense gun safety laws around the country and here in Maryland, including background checks, training requirements, and the protection of those who are survivors of domestic violence from folks who shouldn't get their hands on firearms, I should say. I know that's been near and dear to your heart, Attorney General Brown. Critically working to support our veterans with unmet mental health needs, improving safety, transparency, accountability, and policing. I could go on. And I will say also, I think one of the things that you're most proud of, I know, because I've heard you talk about it before, in the nature of your true character as a public servant and a patriot, Lieutenant Governor, see, there I am. I'm choosing the wrong title for you, Attorney General Brown. Sort of a pick your hat, right? But no, our Attorney General is a true patriot and is a retired colonel from the Army Reserve, having served 3 decades in the Judge Advocate General Corps, and also having served overseas in uniform while he was also serving our state. And so just lived a life of service that he continues to give back to our state. We're really, really pleased to have you serving in this new role. We had a good conversation the last time we saw you about some of the renters issues and tenants issues that you're focused on. And I know, again, that, we know that we've got a great advocate in this office. So we look forward to a partnership with you. But we're really excited to hear from you tonight. And so with that, as I said, I could go on for an hour, but I won't. Instead, I will turn the floor over to you, Attorney General Brown, and thank you for being with us tonight.
Well, thank you, William, and thanks for that really kind introduction. You missed just one thing. You mentioned as Attorney General the first, but what you missed is that I'm the first Attorney General elected from Prince George's County. I was surprised to learn that as I looked at the history of the office and its office holders. But look, I don't come from privilege. I wasn't raised in privilege, but I certainly have had the privilege to be able to do a lot of exciting things on behalf of my neighbors, our community, our state, our country. And it's a real honor to be able to serve as your 47th Attorney General. So, and thank you, William. I want to thank Matt as well, Executive Director, and everything that you all are doing as part of the Montgomery County Renters Alliance. It's very important work. So let me thank you at the outset for that. Karen Strawn, who was mentioned, and Attorney General doesn't go anywhere without having a subject matter expert right next to them. So when we come to Q&A, if there's something I can't answer, Karen certainly will be able to help me out. But she directs our mediation unit in our Consumer Protection Division, where we do mediate. We don't represent, but we do mediate issues, disputes between landlords and tenants. It's not really the bread and butter of what we do in the Consumer Protection Division, because we do a lot, but there is that service. We also provide information to tenants, to renters about their rights under Maryland law. So it really is an honor to be here tonight. Grateful for the opportunity not only to share a few thoughts and information about what we're doing in the office, but also give me an opportunity to hear from you. And I hope to be brief, because open it up for maybe some Q&A, or if you have comments, things you want to bring to my attention. That's as valuable to me as anything else. During the time that I'm going to be with you this evening, and all the folks that are present, and I only see sort of like the panelists, but I understand there's been a big turnout, and because it's such an important topic, and I think really that's a demonstration of this collective commitment that we have to ensuring that every Marylander does have access to safe and affordable housing, and that's not just home ownership; it's rental housing as well, which constitutes an increasing percentage of home options in Maryland, around the country. And so, I think that we have a tremendous task ahead of us in ensuring that every Marylander is safe and can live in an affordable home. And that ranges from the things we have to do to dismantle housing discrimination, what we have to do to promote equitable housing practices, and the things that we have to do to address some of these untenable and unplanned rate hikes that seem to impact so many Marylanders. Discrimination in the rental market remains a pressing issue. We see the data. Black and brown households with lower resources to devote to housing tend to be disproportionately exposed to unsafe housing conditions, leading to health disparities. We see families with children have been turned away from renting in certain apartments, or restricted from accessing public spaces. and the rising costs of rent continues to burden many Maryland families. Single mothers, people of color make up the majority of rent-burdened households, paying over 30% of their income in rent. These realities paint a sobering picture of the challenges that renters in our state face, but they also underscore the urgency and the importance of the work that you all are doing in combating housing discrimination and promoting fair practices. So when I was sworn in as Attorney General now a little over 4 months ago, I did outline what it was characterized. Actually, I declared it myself. It was characterized in the newspaper as an ambitious agenda, where I would focus on civil rights, public safety, police reform, and equity. And my promise has been, since campaigning for the privilege to serve as your Attorney General, that my office would be a partner, a full-fledged partner in the ongoing struggle to protect Marylanders' rights and opportunities. I firmly believe that housing is not just a basic necessity. I do believe it's a fundamental human right. And as your Attorney General, I'm committed to upholding and protecting that right for every resident in Montgomery County and the entire state. So here are some things that we're doing and that we accomplished this session of the General Assembly. And for the first time, and we had the support of Governor Moore, we had the support of every member in the Democratic caucus in the House of Representatives. Interestingly enough, while we lost a few Democrats in the Senate for reasons beyond my understanding, we actually picked up a few Republicans. So it's fair to say that this was bipartisan legislation. And what we did is we passed the Civil Rights Enforcement Act of 2023. And that is a monumental step forward in creating a fair and more just housing landscape in our state. Prior to this bill being signed into law, it'll take effect on October 1st. Your Attorney General did not have the authority to enforce federal and state civil rights laws in housing, public accommodations, but as of October 1st, we will. And my commitment is to root out discrimination and to bring enforcement actions on behalf of Marylanders whose civil rights have been violated. And I think it's a tremendous step forward. This is the example that I use when really pitching this authority in the General Assembly. I said, in 2017, Maryland passed the source of income anti-discrimination bill, right? That I know many of you were advocating for.
We were part of that coalition.
Yep, absolutely, right? So no longer in Maryland since 2017 because you discriminate against a renter based on their source of income. 2 years later, the District of Columbia passed the same bill. Great. They were a little bit behind us, but they got to the right place. Well, a year after that bill was passed in the District of Columbia, Carl Racine brought what today has now been the largest housing discrimination case that he settled for, I think it was $10 million on behalf of the residents of the District of Columbia. And what they found was that a real estate management company was discriminating against prospective renters because of their source of income. Not only did he get monetary relief, but also injunctive relief. And many of those bad actors can no longer participate in the real estate management industry in the District of Columbia. We do big things in Maryland on behalf of renters. Our Consumer Protection Division last year settled a large case against Westminster Management. They had about 7,000, 8,000 units under management. It was a consumer protection action that we brought. They were showing pristine, well-maintained units. They were making promises about how they would be responsive in maintenance. They were charging fees that were above what they're allowed to charge for deposits and other fees. And using the Consumer Protection Act, we recovered over $3 million in restitution to the state and also in restitution to renters because they failed to maintain the units. Poor maintenance, some of them rodent and insect infested. So where we have the authority and the power to act, we have done it on behalf of renters. So I'm really excited with this new authority to bring civil rights enforcement actions, what we're going to be able to do in Maryland to make sure that a family with children is not prevented from renting in a certain place, a family that looks a certain way or that is in a relationship or that is not viewed as traditional are not going to be discriminated against, because we're going to be able to protect all Marylanders when it comes to their housing choices. We're really excited about that. In addition to the Civil Rights Enforcement Authority, we're making progress in addressing the challenges faced by renters in other ways. In 2021, Maryland became the second state in the nation to require, and you know this, legal counsel in eviction proceedings for income eligible tenants. And just 2 weeks ago, I think it was, Governor Moore signed Senate Bill 756, which provides critical and continued funding for access to counsel in evictions. That special fund, it'll be funded through 2027 at the tune of $14 million. In my view, being evicted from your home can be as life-altering as being incarcerated in the local jail. And if we can provide access to counsel in that criminal context, we need to be able to provide access to counsel in the eviction process. The law's in place, the funding's in place. And again, I applaud you for your advocacy to ensure that funding for the benefit of income eligible individuals, they will now receive meaningful legal representation. And the continued funding of that program is crucial. I think if we're going to level that playing field, landlord, tenant, renters, security in your home. So we're really excited about that. A few other things I'll just tick off real quick. Our office actively supported written testimony, in some cases oral testimony, House Bill 36, actions to repossess, right? Proof of rental licensure. And we supported that legislation. And as you know, signed into law this month. And it provides additional protection to renters by requiring landlords to comply with licensing requirements before evicting tenants for failure to pay rent. And we look, it's important for a lot of reasons. There is a correlation, not to say that every licensed landlord is playing by all the rules, but chances are when a landlord is abiding by licensing and licensing requirements, it's more likely that you're going to get a landlord that is doing the right thing. Not always the case, but we think that bill was important. And House Bill 151, notification of rent increases, which, as you know, and we supported that, it benefits Marylanders by providing protection against sudden and significant rent increases. So the legislation requires landlords to notify tenants in writing or through email at least 120 days in advance before increasing the rent by more than 4%. And currently tenants often face, as we know, unexpected and unmanageable rent hikes without sufficient time to, try to negotiate or at least to find affordable alternatives. And we know how difficult that is as well. So let me just wrap up by saying that, my office and I, we understand the impact that discriminatory and unfair rental practices have on individuals and families. It's why we're committed to strengthen those protections, why we're committed to bringing enforcement actions, why we're committed to working with the community and members of the legislature to continue to do the work to ensure that housing choice, housing options are available for all Marylanders, that it's affordable, free from discrimination, it's safe, and it's secure. So let me just wrap up by saying thank you to the Montgomery County Renters Alliance for this platform for me this evening to talk a little bit about what we're doing and to give you a real sense of my commitment, just like my predecessor, Brian Frost, his commitment to fighting for renters throughout the state of Maryland. Thank you.
Thank you, Attorney General Brown. Really an honor to have you. So many accomplishments, and you're just getting started. A couple things I just wanted to note. We were very much a part of getting that licensure bill passed. We were also part of getting the access to counsel funding and the legislation passed. One of our board members, Vaughn Stewart, was on Attorney General Frosch's task force and our advocate for us. And we are also the leading co-founders of Renters United Maryland, which is our ramshackle group of advocates across the state, but very much working in favor and support of advancing renters' rights and protections throughout Maryland. And we've all been working passionately to get this stuff done. So I'm going to ask the most difficult question first, sir, because I know you can handle it based on your experience. Just cause eviction. It is a very, very important issue for the Renters Alliance. We have been working on it for more than a decade. One of our board members, Delegate Janelle Wilkins, has been championing this year in and year out. There have been political obstacles that I'm sure you're aware of. Things are changing up. We're going to see a new chair of the Environment and Transportation Committee, Mark Corman, Delegate Mark Corman. But most importantly, I guess, given your background as a Harvard Law graduate and a patriot and a fighter, what are your thoughts on protecting us and protecting renters against evictions without cause? And I'm sure you're familiar with what just cause is, but for our audience, let me just quickly say that right now with 60 days notice in the state of Maryland, a landlord can issue a notice to vacate. And if you stay 1 day longer than the lease term, you're what's known as tenant holding over. And the landlord can file in court to have you evicted for tenant holding over. And the only thing that the judge will ask is whether or not you got sufficient notice. Now, you can say that you've been retaliated against, but if the landlord does not have to state the reason for the notice to vacate, it becomes very difficult to really impossible to defend against it in court. Just cause eviction protection would require that a lease automatically renew, absent just cause not to. That includes all of the reasons why a Judge Judy would say you should be evicted from your home, and as well as some business reasons, such as the landlord, a small landlord, for example, taking a rental unit off the market permanently, or any landlord doing renovations or some kind of construction that would make the apartment uninhabitable, and other sort of reasonable business reasons that any judge would agree is a fair reason with proper notice to say that tenants can no longer live there. Absent that, if they intend to lease the apartment in perpetuity, in order to evict somebody, the just cause would require that they have a justifiable reason. So, Attorney General Brown, what's your opinion?
Absolutely support it. In fact, when I was speaking with Janelle Wilkins last year, and I was talking about, my desire to serve as Maryland's next Attorney General and some of the things that were important to me during that conversation, as is usual. And I say, what's important to you? What's your agenda? And she said to me, top on my agenda is just cause evictions. Where are you on that? And she educated me on it. I have a full understanding of it, and I support that. I think that, look, regardless of whether you own or rent, we should be living in a society where the security in that dwelling is as close to equal as possible. I mean, there are some things that rental tenancy does not afford that you have in home ownership. But if you're paying your rent, if you're, and the unit stays on the market, if you are not creating, a nuisance or engage in criminal activity, then you should have the security and the expectation, so long as you're writing that rental payment every month, pursuant to the terms of the lease, then you should have security in that. No different than if I go and buy a home, as long as I'm making my mortgage payments, like, no one's going to move me out of my house. If I break the law, I might be moved out. I might go to jail. And if the state condemns my property because they want to run a highway through it, and I've got an opportunity to go to court on that, I could lose my home. But we know that just doesn't happen on a regular basis. You should have the same level of security in your home, even as a renter. So I support it. And I believe, and while I didn't mention it in my remarks, because I was touching upon the bills that were signed into law, we did support and Karen can correct me if I'm mistaken, but I think we did provide written testimony for that this legislative session, and I'll continue to be an advocate for that.
Well, that is brilliant, and we are particularly pleased with that. It has been a long struggle, but as an educated man, you know the civil rights movement didn't happen overnight, and renters' rights is taking a while, too long for many people, but it is going to happen eventually, and with your support especially. One of the things that
the source of income bill that we talked about earlier that was passed in 2017, I remember debating that in the House Judiciary Committee in 2002. And it was probably debated in that committee before I became a member of that committee in 2002. So often things take time, and that's why it takes committed people like the Renters Alliance and the men and women that are making up this alliance. We just got to stick to it, and we'll get it done.
We're particularly grateful of your passion on civil rights and perhaps your understanding of the linkage between how the absence of just cause protection creates a terrible opportunity for all types of chicanery, from retaliation, not just for renters pursuing promised or required services or their rights, but also a terrible opportunity for discrimination. And so thank you for all of that. William, anybody else? Questions for our Attorney General?
I was actually trying to look. I know David and some other folks are monitoring the chat to see if there were some folks raised. I know Attorney General Brown, we'd spent some time. You mentioned your predecessor. We'd spent some time working over the last couple sessions with AG Frosch about trying to sort of push through some bills that came from the office around raising the threshold for the pittance it costs, for instance, to file evictions for folks and some of those other things. And so I know those are things that are on your radar as sessions come up as well.
Yeah, the one thing I'll say about I think my rationale would be different. And I think you're referencing the bill that would increase the cost to file an eviction.
Yes. Yes.
And one of the things that does concern me, and I want to be candid, right, in our mutual effort to protect renters. I don't want to say we should be increasing the filing fees for an eviction action to make it harder for a landlord to evict, because you don't want to use fees as a way to modulate the access to our courts. And I say this only because there was a time in our country when fees were used to put barriers to the access to the ballot. So I do think we have to fully fund our courts. And I do think that landlords in Maryland are filing at a higher rate than other states. So part of supporting our courts is making sure they have the resources to do their work. So we should be looking to increase fees to support the work of the court. So it's getting in the same place, but I think really the rationale, I think that I would articulate is it's necessary to support the work of the courts.
We have some history with that, as you might know, Attorney General Brown, with working on increasing the filing fee. I believe it was from what is now one of the lowest filing fees in the nation to something between $60 and $120, which would be on average with several the major states, California, New York, Virginia, and others, with the objective being that we're seeing so many landlords using the courts as kind of collection agencies for common, late payments or whatever in rent that require tenants, especially low-income tenants and working families, to have to spend a day in court when they don't have to, and really using the courts as a kind of a collection agency. But then one of the rubs with the bill is that we couldn't get it to people to agree that the filing fee should not be passed on to the tenants. And so that was an absolute red line for us, that it shouldn't become a tax on the working poor, essentially, or on working tenants. but it's still something that is for consideration.
Got it.
Perhaps some nitty gritty here would be helpful, Attorney General. I always feel like I want to get into a graduate seminar with someone with your education and background, but maybe it would be more helpful for our tenants to talk about how your office can be accessed by a tenant who is seeking assistance from your departments.
Great. And I mean, you can certainly visit us at Maryland Attorney General Karen, what's our, I'm thinking about my email address. What's the best way to contact us, Karen?
www.marylandattorneygeneral.gov, G-O-V.
And you know, look, we have a consumer protection division that is one of the largest divisions in our office, and we're actually supplemented by some really generous volunteers who give of their time. Some of them are located in some of our consumer protection offices around the state. Many of them are in 200 St. Paul. So you can visit us online. If you go online, you'll also see a phone number you can call in as well. And we're here to help and to provide information, to mediate matters when both parties are willing to enter into mediation, which is not always the case. So because it won't work unless they do. But we're, you know, certainly in our consumer protection division are here to help. We're unable to represent renters in court. That's why I was really excited. We never have been able to, but that's why I was really excited to secure that $14 million for the access to counsel and evictions.
Attorney General Brown, or perhaps Karen, we have some, I don't want to say confusion, but we have tenants with all kinds of issues. And of course, usually we direct them to our local housing departments to resolve landlord-tenant disputes and other complaints. But perhaps you could tell us a little bit about where the division should be. When should they come to the Attorney General's office? And what are the things that you can mediate versus how would a complaint, what kinds of complaints might you receive that might rise to the level of a larger investigation by your office?
Karen?
Well, the important thing is to make sure that we're aware of the problems that are out there, because when you're talking about whether or not things should be raised to a level of enforcement, we get complaints and we often look at complaints to determine if there's a particular problem that's a violation of the law, that's a pattern by a particular landlord, for example, or property manager. And we are looking to see if we can determine that they are doing something that's in violation of the law on a regular basis. Because if that's occurring and it's something that's happening and affecting a lot of people in Maryland, we want to take action against those individuals that are doing those types of actions. So, you know, filing a complaint with us or filing a complaint with Montgomery County is important, but by filing it with us, you have the opportunity that there is the potential for us to take an enforcement action, which may or may not be possible through Montgomery County because they have different resources than what we have.
And the resources that we, I mean, and I mentioned that Westminster case last year. And as Karen mentioned, we're looking for practices, patterns and practices so that we can demonstrate that there is a misleading and deceptive practice of that landlord, of that management company. And that's why, you know, the one-off cases are difficult, if even possible, for our office to do, because it's usually not enough to develop a practice. But again, as Karen mentions, we welcome the complaints because that's how we build cases to bring against landlords, management companies, etc.
Do you review a complaint as perhaps exemplary of a larger practice that should be investigated? For example, and we don't have time to go into the list of all the patterns and practices of abuse that we're seeing out there, but say a common abuse we're seeing is in record keeping and tallying of people's rental records We are seeing, fees being charged that should not be charged. We're seeing miscalculations. We're seeing utility fees added that are not added correctly. And we know that if it's happening to one tenant at a larger apartment complex, it's likely happening to hundreds. Is that something that you might consider, not just as a one-off, but as a signal that something larger is going on?
Absolutely. That's what we're looking for. All complaints are reviewed by a supervisor, and we divide things by the business name so that the supervisor is seeing the same businesses over and over again so that we can determine, is there a pattern? Is there something that's affecting more than just one individual, something that's not just a one-off, as you say, but something that's affecting a number of people. And we look at, even if the business is willing to work with us on that particular case and resolve it, if it's a problem that's affecting that individual, that clearly they did something wrong, unless they are willing to indicate to us that they're going to resolve the problem for all of their consumers, that's something that we consider in determining whether or not we're going to take an enforcement action.
Very good. If there are no other questions for the Attorney General, Will, would you like to last remarks? Sorry, David, yes?
There are a couple that maybe if there's time, I don't know if we need to move on or not, but one about fair housing enforcement and whether our current wiretapping laws don't allow the kind of investigation needed, and whether you'd support an exception to allow that to happen. I guess if there's testers going in, I guess, trying to record. Apparently, I don't know if there's a barrier with our current wiretapping law was the question, or that the comment on that one.
I'm not sure about the wiretapping thing.
Look, I know there's legislation that is, or bills that are introduced every session to create exemptions for the ability to record a third party without consent. And I think that's what the question is about. There was a bill this year in the context of domestic violence. The chat, I guess the question was, what about an exemption if someone's going in to try to record something that could uncover wrongdoing in the rental context? Look, those are policy decisions that the General Assembly has to make. If we can find ways to facilitate renters to be able to demonstrate evidence and bring forth wrongdoing by landlords, then I think we ought to do that. Now, does that mean we have exemptions to our Wiretap Act? I've got to give that I'd have to give that further consideration. We have probably one of the strictest provisions in the country around that. And the General Assembly's thought about it for a number of years, hasn't really moved much on it. I can't say that I've given it the kind of thought that, where I can give a good answer tonight as to whether an exemption should exist in this sort of rental context.
Sorry, Lisa Sorrow, our friend who's a brilliant lawyer out there in near Annapolis. I get the question now, and it is a good question, and we'll allow the Attorney General to cogitate and hopefully come up with an opinion. But yes, the ability for testers to provide evidence is an important objective. We all agree. Anything else, David or anybody?
One more I'll drop in is do you think maybe should it be easier to get as a tenant an eviction kind of case off your record, as it were? I don't know if they mean credit or whatever. The court, get it off your record, especially if you qualified for some kind of rental assistance, that showed that there was an irregularity or something.
Yeah, I think that's sort of common sense, and I could certainly support that. I mean, if there's a rationale, justification, a reason why, then I think we should make that available to clean up someone's credit rating because of that. Absolutely.
Good.
Awesome.
Right.
Awesome. Look at that. No, we appreciate those great questions. And as folks can see from the chat, Karen has dropped some of the resources that they were talking about in terms of reaching out to the Attorney General's office, following along with what's going on. Just a ton of things going on in the remit there, Attorney General Brown. But we want to thank you for spending some time with us tonight. I know there are many things that you could be doing right now and many things you're probably about to go do. So we really appreciate the opportunity to be in dialogue with you, and more importantly, to be in partnership with you on all of this work. As Matt said, really just getting started. And it's a very long list for being, a couple months into the job, but we know that you were serious about making good use of the time, and so we're really excited to roll up our sleeves in partnership with you as we move forward. So just want to thank you again for spending some time with us, and we look forward to the work ahead. Thank you to you and to Karen as well.
William and Matt, and to the members of the Renters Alliance, thanks for having us, and have a great Memorial Day weekend. Enjoy the summer. We'll see you.
We intend to. By the way, you don't have a dock near a crabbing spot somewhere, do you?
No, I'm looking for one.
Well, when you find one, please let us know. I can bring
Good
about
deal.
50 people to your party.
Thanks so much, Attorney General
right,
Brown.
take
We
care.
appreciate it. Have
All
a
right.
great night.
And it looks like we are also honored to have us with us tonight, the council member from, Andrew, what's district?
District 1. District 1, Council Vice
District 1, thank you.
President Andrew Fried.
This is the age catching up with me. From District 1, it is
You had me at
Councilmember
crab
Andrew
pot,
Friedson.
Matt. You had me
Sorry?
at crab pot.
What?
You had me at crab pot.
Yeah. Crab pot or crackpot, that goes to me. Council member from District 1, who is also the chair of the Planning, Housing, and Parks Committee. And he is the lead co-sponsor of the anti-rent gouging bill. There are two bills under consideration by the county right now. The Home Act, which is leading co-sponsors are Will Jawando and Kristen Mink. And the anti-rent gouging bill, leading co-sponsor is Councilmember Andrew Friedson with Councilmember Natalie Fanny Gonzalez. So we welcome you. We're glad you're here. This is part of our ongoing discussion with the public on rent stabilization, addressing some of the excessive rent increases that we're seeing across the county, and hoping that the council will act affirmatively to protect renters. Councilmember Friedson, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Matt. Thank you, Will. Thank you to everybody here. It's good to see many friends and a big crowd here as well. So that's great. I appreciate you providing me the opportunity to be here for us to talk about this issue. I think the first is that we agree that there's a problem and that we have to address the problem. I understand that there are some differences and views on exactly how best to address that problem and where ultimately we ought to land. But I think the fact that we have agreed broadly, and I would say universally at the county council, that we need to step up and address that problem is significant. And I think it's important that we note that this would be the first time if one of these bills goes through or some compromised version of either of them, it would be the first permanent rental protection in any significant way in this mechanism, probably ever or since the 1970s, depending on how you view what happened in the 1970s. And I will leave it to you all who are greater experts in this field than I am to make that determination, but either ever or in my lifetime is still pretty good. I will say, and I think that's significant. And I have personally evolved on this issue. We have seen and heard from our residents and constituents of 30, 40, 50% rent increases, which are egregious and should not happen ever. There is no circumstance under which I think that is acceptable. And I think it's important. And that is the question before us, is at what point we provide an intervention and at what level is reasonable and at what level we get to the best outcome. And obviously there are differences of opinion of what that level ought to be and should be. And I think it's important for us to have that discussion. We all agree that there are bad actors, as I mentioned. I don't believe that most landlords are doing this, but I do believe that some landlords are doing this. And I think that those landlords who are doing it need to be stopped. And it's absolutely unconscionable. And, we have received some of the data and some of the information from DHCA. We received the anecdotal information from residents and from organizations like yours. And obviously, those situations are serious, are important. And I don't want to discount the fact, I say a lot that the plural of data is not anecdote. And I think that's important in our policymaking. But every anecdote is a story. It's somebody's story. And it has a real impact, an existential impact on that person or that family or that group. And finding the right balance of the data and the anecdote, and recognizing that these anecdotes are people and homes are at the core of where people are and what their stability is, I really do think is essential. So, where we are on this bill, we introduced this bill. Natalie and I get all the credit and the attention or the blame, depending on whom you ask. But there are 6 of us that are all part of this effort. And the goal here was to get 6 people who'd be willing to sign on to something, to anything, to something that would provide protection. And I will say that the legislative process is challenging. And I think that there is a lot of view out there that we should just take the 2 different bills and just meet in the middle. And I think that that's a reasonable approach for some people. I think the challenge is there are some on one bill that wouldn't go up to what that middle would be. And there are some on the other bill that wouldn't go down to where that number would be. And so the question is, can you land at a point where you actually have 6 or more people who are willing to agree on a number? So that's the challenges that we have. We all support safe and stable housing. We all have been doing a lot of work to try to address housing. I think I have done about as much on trying to address the crisis of the availability of housing as just about anybody. And I think the last council has done more on housing issues than any 4-year council ever. And, I think if you look at the 3 members of the prior Fed committee, Hans Riemer and me and Will Juando, we don't agree on everything, but we did a tremendous amount in consensus and in agreement on addressing issues related to housing over the last 4 years. And much of that has continued and will continue with this new Planning, Housing, and Parks Committee with Natalie Fanny Gonzalez joining Will Juando and I. So we have a housing crisis. I have been very focused on the housing crisis. The housing crisis is related to a lot of things, but I do believe a key part of it is supply and demand. There is too few amount of housing and types of housing, and too many people who want that housing. And so the balance of power is more in landlords' favor. And I think we agree on that wholeheartedly. I think the question is, why is that? And how do you address that? And certainly there are interventions to address that in a specific way at a specific time that has other consequences. But the overarching and long-term way that we address it, from my opinion, is to create more housing at every level, affordable housing and housing at every level. And that means rental housing. And I have taken some controversial positions in my district and beyond to support more rental housing, more affordable housing, and more housing more generally, because I do think long-term that is the way that we address the issue.
So Councilmember Friedson, might be helpful, since the time is valuable here. One of the things that we'd like to start with is if you could give us sort of an anatomy of your bill And if you're familiar with the other bill, the anatomy of the other bill, and tell us the sort of your pros and cons of the elements, so then we know what we're talking about.
Yeah.
What is
So I'll focus on our bill if that's okay. And, if
Sure.
people want to ask the contrast, I'll do my best, but it's hard for me to advocate for, someone else's bill or against someone else's bill. But
I was going to say, you don't have to advocate for it, but you can talk about it.
So our bill is a rent gouging bill. It prevents the huge, and egregious increases in rent that we think are incredibly, under any circumstance, not acceptable. And so it's 8% plus CPI, plus the consumer price index. And there are exemptions in both bills. Ours is a little bit longer, but for new construction to address that primary concern. I believe their bill is 10 years, our bill is 15 years. But the crux of it, the heart of it, is their bill is a 3% max cap, but the history is about a 2.1% on average, has been the rental increase over the recent history. And it's whichever is higher, whichever is lower. So 3% is the ultimate cap, and it would be 2.1 in most years, or below 3% most years. And ours is an anti-gouging measure that would be at 8%. There are, my concern about their bill and my reason for supporting our bill is, I think we have to be careful about how blunt an instrument we use and what the unintended consequences would be. And I understand that there are differences of opinion of that. And you could find a study to tell me one thing, and I could find you a study to tell you the exact opposite thing, and we'd both be convinced that we were right. And it's one of the challenges of this issue. I was just having a meeting earlier today going through research with objective researchers. And one of the things that they said, which I think is really telling in this conversation, is that there really is insufficient data to determine like item by like item, like community by like community. And so there is a grain of salt in virtually every study that has come out up to this point, on many of these issues. And I say that as somebody who has cited studies, and I will continue to cite studies that justify my position here, that having a higher number that prevents gouging, kind of more traditional price gouging, consumer protection style gouging, and then focusing support targeted to the people who need it the most with, rental subsidies and other, aspects, helps to address some of the unintended consequences of a stricter and more blunt rent control, while making sure that the support and the benefits get it to the people who need it the most. I think that is really the crux of the debate.
Well, let me just run through a couple of the details. That it's 8% plus the CPI, which now would be about 12.5%, something like that. That's what your bill is calling for. The Home Act is calling for a cap at 3%. We're particularly welcoming what you just said, and Councilmember Friedson, on the future of compromise. We look forward to that conversation. Also, your bill, the anti-rent gouging bill, would, I believe, exempt small landlords. So that those who have a smaller number of units would be exempted. It does call for investment of something like $30 million in investment in housing. One concern that comes up frequently that we hear is the idea of providing rental subsidies, while at the same time allowing for increases upwards of 12%. The concern is that all we're doing is providing public dollars to subsidize excessive rents in some way. And is that a concern of yours?
Yeah, I understand the argument. I think some people have made the same argument of, doing public housing and social housing, which I'm also a big supporter of, and, created $100 million fund with colleagues to, support that. I don't share that concern in the sense that, we can only nurture nature, in the sense that no matter how many subsidies we provide, we're not going to change the entire regional economy or the entire housing market in Montgomery County. We're making a marginal impact on an individual unit. And so from a broad economic standpoint, I don't think we could possibly come up with the amount, of rental subsidies, billions of dollars in rental subsidies that would have a market difference, frankly, on the average rent. I think there's two aspects and elements to this from my perspective. One is we don't have enough people who can afford housing, whether it's buying a home or renting a home. Housing is unaffordable to most people in Montgomery County today. I think most of that is a supply and demand challenge. We have not built enough housing over the last 30, 40 years, and we are grappling with that reality. And I think we need to change the way that we view housing as infrastructure. But that is one of the issues. By providing a shallow subsidy or some other form of subsidy to a resident, I don't think it dramatically changes what the landlord is going to be able to provide, or charge, on the broader market. Ultimately, the market is going to decide that. Now, there are exceptions to me, and the exceptions are bad actors. And if we look at the data, and this is true in code enforcement, the evictions, the code violations are overwhelmingly coming from a very small number of landlords who have an overwhelming number of the problems. They have unsafe conditions in housing. They provide, much of the challenges that we have. We've added code enforcers, by the way, which is a shared interest and concern I know that we all have, that I advocated for. I went against myself and said we should increase rental fees, which increases rental housing, which I've always, I've been concerned about, as long as it goes to getting more code enforcers. Like, if that is what we're using this money for, that's good for everybody, and let's do it so we can have safe and dignified housing for everybody. But I don't share the concern that the public subsidies going to individual people would be enough to make a dramatic change in the market for housing. I think that's mostly dictated by the fact that we have too many people who want housing and too little housing to support and provide for them.
Let me ask you a sort of a more fundamental question, and I appreciate that. And I appreciate also, that you talked a little bit about the nature of studies, and for sure, I know both in the public testimony, both sessions, and stuff that's been sent up, y'all have heard a lot, I'm sure, from academics who have studied this issue and studied how stabilization policies have gone right and not gone so right, in other jurisdictions. And I think we should be looking at sort of best practices there. But we talked about sort of, I understand the perspective from the anti-gouging standpoint of wanting to go at the bad actors, right, who are charging, things that we know to be on their face egregious, 20 some odd %, et cetera, right? But we also know that, talking realistically about that affordability crunch for folks, that a lot of the angst here in this discussion, as I'm sure you've heard as we have, and you can see it in the chat, aren't just from folks who are in the 14 and 15 to 24% that's clearly gouging, but from folks who, for whom a jump of 5-6% is, that equating to a couple $100, let's say, is going to force them out of their homes, right? And we know, like, from some anecdotal data, and it'd be great if the county had better data. I know you've talked about that a lot, right? We know. Yeah, absolutely. So we know
agree on that too. There's a lot of
we are in agreement on that. We know from anecdotal data, at least that generally, as we said, most landlords are increasing in that 2 to 3 to 4% range or so, some range that is a sort of commensurate with the voluntary rent guidelines. But we know that a lot of the majority of the double-digit rent increases that have at least been reported to DHCA, which is just the tip of the iceberg, right? Are folks that are more than likely, low income folks, Black and brown folks who are, persons with disabilities, or folks with kids in schools, et cetera. This collection of people that we've been talking about are really in this sort of forced migration crunch because of the affordability. So I'm wondering, get into a question, I promise. Given that we know how the sausage is made, you got to negotiate to a number. But if you negotiate to a number, or if you start your bill at a number, which, 8% plus CPI, which is essentially a double-digit increase that folks can't afford, who are we helping, right? Like if we end up getting to a place, and whatever the number might be, but if we end up getting to a place where the only numbers on the table that we think there are votes for aren't actually going to help the people who need the help the most, then what are we doing? Like, what is this exercise for, right? That's what a lot of the angst from people are about. Not that they think that, I think that, folks who are behind this bill in the council somehow want to push people out, but that the number that a majority of the council is on right now in your bill does, right? So,
well, I appreciate
about that a little bit more.
Yeah, I didn't mean to interrupt. I'm sorry.
No, you're good.
I really appreciate the framing of the question and the question. Here is the difference of opinion, I think, and it's a respectful difference. But I think that there is a view among some, and I'm sure it's shared by many on this call, that the number that we set is the number that landlords will go to because they're getting clearance essentially to go to it. I don't agree with that. And I don't think that the evidence suggests that will happen. This is intended to be a stopgap to prevent the bad actors. And I agree, I understand that that's not enough for many people. And for the argument that you are making, and I respect that, I really do. But I think that is the part of, at least, the disagreement is, one, the number that you are setting is the number that you're saying is okay to rent on everybody at all times, everywhere. And I just don't think that's true. We have historic rent increases of 2.1%, in recent history in Montgomery County. The market will do what it will do, except in cases where people do things that they shouldn't be doing, that are outside of the market forces. And generally, consumer protections and gouging measures are to prevent non-market forces of people who are just doing bad things to take advantage of vulnerable people. And again, I respect that is not what you're advocating for. You're advocating for more than that. And that's an important distinction. But I think that the first point that I want to make is, I don't believe anybody is saying, here's the number that we think is acceptable, and 1 point above that is too much and egregious, and 1 point below that is okay. What we have set up is a scenario where if you exceed this number, you legally don't have the authority to do that. And we will never allow you to do that under any circumstances, no matter what, ever. And right now, if the county is saying it has no cap, so, and has never had a cap, but for a temporary period of time during the pandemic, and we didn't see most people raising rents 20, 30, 40%, which they could do without the cap. I think the other issue that I'm concerned about is it's not just about getting to a number. That is one of, we have a legislative process, we got to get 6, and there are a lot of dynamics to get there. It's also about the unintended consequences of using too blunt of an instrument and how low you go. And I do have a concern, and I'll be honest about it. And I have been honest and open about this. I do believe that at a certain point, you are more likely to have naturally occurring affordable housing being knocked down and redeveloped into new, more expensive, less affordable housing. That is a concern that I have. And I think that's true of a lot of regulatory aspects that we take on that are well-intended, that are intended to help people who need it the most, and they end up hurting people who need it the most unintentionally. I am concerned about rental housing turning to condo, because if you use too blunt of an instrument, the people who have the choices will take their choices and will use their choices. And so the balance is not just in terms of finding 6 votes and getting to a point or we can move something forward. It's also finding balance to not cause more problems than we're trying to solve. And I understand that there are very strong emotional, serious, deeply personal disagreements of at what point that happens and who we should trust in terms of at what point that happens. And I acknowledge that and I respect that, but I think that is in many ways, where the rubber meets the road, at least for me, is figuring out at what point are we risking the naturally occurring affordable housing that is a critical part of our affordable housing stock, and it's unregulated.
So, Councilmember, let me throw in a
Please.
couple things also to keep some of the aspects, to get your opinion on some of the concerns that are raised. I'll tell a quick story, since I perhaps have the longest history. Well, maybe Chris Berry's got more history than I do, but I have some of the longest history in dealing with this from way back when we passed the Renter Protection Act back in 2015.
You've been around since 1950, man. 15, you are, God bless you.
I feel like it sometimes.
Yeah.
David Hillman, I'm sure you remember him, may he rest in peace, the late founder of Southern Management, who was in opposition to many of the renters' rights legislation we were pushing. But on the issue of code control, code inspections, we were pushing, as you know, an aggressive approach to code enforcement and targeting chronically violating buildings. And David Hillman said, go right ahead, because that'll never happen in any of my buildings. Because he was proud of the work that he was doing, he was proud of his complexes. So you mentioned that the majority of landlords just don't raise rents more than 2 or 3%. And so I would ask, why not just pass a bill if it's not going to impact the landlords who are not raising their rents that way anyway, and keep it at something that is a little bit more reasonable than, say, a double-digit rent increase? That was one issue that gets raised. If it's not going to impact those who are being responsible, then why not put in the protection to make sure that anyone who's being irresponsible is now required to be responsible on terms of rent increases? The other thing was that comes up frequently as a discussion point on policy is that somehow the market or rent increases in affordability can be solved by building our way out of it, so to speak. Renters Alliance has never taken the position of anti-development, build away, don't build. That's our issue, is what happens to people when they get into their homes and how stable they are once they get into their homes. So the second part of my concern that's raised by many is, do you believe that we could build enough housing to flood the market in order to bring rent increases down? And to what extent would that protect people, the nearly 400,000 residents in Montgomery County who live in rental housing now and are seeing these kinds of rent increases?
The answer to that question is yes, I do, fundamentally. I just think it will take a long time to do that. So the issue is, yes, unequivocally, there is no doubt in my mind that if we had a sufficient supply of housing at every level, and housing, I disagree with the county executive on a number of things. One of the areas is about zoning. And one of the ways that I describe zoning, and housing is a core part of that, is it's not just what zoning you have in what area, it's whether you have it in the place where people want it and need it. And so, it's like, to me, it's like a grocery store. If we said, listen, there's plenty of groceries in Montgomery County. Well, if you don't have the produce in a place that's accessible to somebody who can get it, then that doesn't help them in their family. And in many ways, housing is similar. So it's not strictly just about the number and the people. It's about making sure that the number meets the individual needs. Is it the right number of bedrooms? Is it the right type of housing? Does it have access to the right transportation or jobs or whatever the case may be? So it's obviously, it's a very complicated and nuanced dynamic. But if you had sufficient supply, yes, you would absolutely, in my view, you would equalize and level the playing field so that a tenant would have a lot more power in a discussion and a negotiation with a landlord, because they'd run the risk of it. And if you want to see how that works, just look at the labor market right now. The labor market has fundamentally changed based on a small change in the number of people participating, relatively, mostly women, by the way, who have not returned to work and have been impacted more by the she-cession as it's been called. And that relatively small percentage change, but huge number change, because we're talking about the whole country here, has fundamentally shifted the power structure between employees and employers. There is now a labor shortage, and so employees have more power to get higher pay. And if you had asked somebody
Did you
about that
read the
10 years
article in the
ago,
Washington Post a couple of days ago that pointed out that housing affordability is forcing out working and low-income families and college-educated students who can't afford to live here, and therefore we don't have the people to hire?
and we agree, and by the way, we agree on that. We absolutely agree on that. And I've talked about housing as an economic development necessity, and I believe housing is infrastructure for that reason. And so I think it's important. Now, having said that, my approach to housing hasn't been just to build new housing and not worry about anything else. In fact, I'm working on a $50 million preservation fund right now. And by the way, every one of those units in those preservation fund buildings through nonprofits will be rent controlled, because they will follow the voluntary rent guidelines, because they will be under DHCA agreement, just like every single HOC property. So I just think it's important. I'm not somebody who doesn't believe in the need to provide safe and stable housing. It's a question of at what point does the solution that we're trying to put in place provide more unintended consequences, perhaps, than the problems we're trying to solve. And that's, again, it's a nuanced, a nuanced position. There's room for disagreement here. To the question before about, well, if most people are raising their rents only 2 to 3% on average, why not just cap it at 2 to 3%? The challenge for that actually has less to do with the micro environment in Montgomery County of actual landlords and more to do with financing of housing. And the challenge that you get is that if you put in place too strict of a policy, you run the risk of the financing being difficult, because that is an issue and has been an issue and a challenge. And it's less an issue to me, honestly, on constructing new buildings. I am concerned about whether the people who are making choices of where to build housing won't build it in Montgomery County. That's an issue, but a far greater issue to me, and one that isn't addressed, because the 10 and 15 years, I think 15 years addressed better, but that helps to address this concern that many have had. My bigger concern is about the question of, if you have a 50-year-old building that is quite an affordable building, are you going to invest the money to make it and continue to maintain it as a good, dignified, safe building? Are you going to continue to provide it at that level, or are you going to sell it and have somebody knock it down and build something else? Or are you going to knock it down and build something else? And if you can't get the financing for that building, the cash flow's got to come out of somewhere. And we agree on that, Matt. I mean, we've talked about this. You don't think that somebody should make no money from building housing, because then they wouldn't build the housing. You agree?
We put in our memo to you and the council.
Yep, I
very
appreciate
clearly. Our first principle was that there needs to be a balance with a landlord that should be able to get a fair return and keep up with expenses, on balance with the industry responsibility to provide stable, affordable housing for the long term, for permanent renters, again, who are now nearly 40% of the county.
And I appreciate that. And let me just answer one on the other question that you asked. The 2 to 3% is the average, and what the setting the cap at that number of 2 to 3% is essentially saying that anything above the average, which is what the voluntary rent guideline is based on, is excessive and egregious, and under no circumstances should happen. And if it does happen and you want it to happen, then you should have to appeal to the county and go through a process to get that done. That is a very high burden and a very challenging burden to go above the average. And I think we have to be honest about that. And I respect that there are people who believe that that is how it should happen, but that is a stricter level of rent stabilization than almost anywhere. I mean, I can't think of a place that has.
Well, that's why the Renters Alliance hasn't picked a number, though we can assure you that 12.5% is not our number. So we are looking forward to a serious discussion about what that supports the principle that we stand for. We understand the landlord side of it. We understand the tenant side of it. We were formed to advocate for the renter interests, which for many, many decades around here was given short shrift as a voice in public affairs. And now here we are. What else? We should
Can I
probably
just
move
also
to.
note that obviously we're having this conversation for a permanent measure in the highest interest rate environment that we have experienced in a really, really long time, almost, in decades and decades and decades. So obviously that also has added to the emotional response to the conversation, which I understand, because the likelihood that we will continue with this level of inflation is extremely unlikely, and history would suggest happens almost never. The interest, is to get inflation, and historically it has been in recent years close to 2%. And so I just, I'm not pushing back. I just think it's important for us to recognize the interest among many is for us to put in place a permanent measure. There has been major resistance to permanent measures, partially for this reason, that it's very hard to come up with an appropriate number that is evergreen.
Well, that's why you guys get the big bucks. And we're looking forward to, you all with your nose to the grindstone as the budget now being behind you, you can focus on these public policy issues. I will point out that based on our research and the research from experts that we've brought in, that the places like Washington, D.C., which has, according to this research, the #1 investment in new public housing and has rent stabilization in their program. Your bill and the other bill both exempt new investment in housing. And I think that any rent stabilization program that we've ever supported always had some kind of a escape valve or flexibility that if a landlord or investor were not making back their return, that there would be some way for them to be exempted further so that they get their investment and some profit. So I don't think the Renters Alliance would ever oppose that part of a market interest, investment in housing. And in those places with the strictest rent stabilization laws like New York and Seattle and San Francisco, they all have some of the most profitable and highly invested renter stocks in the world. Will and David and Pat and everybody, we should probably give our poor renters who have every right to be emotional about possibly losing their homes to ask their questions. And that would be the time.
Yeah, and I know we've been sort of incorporating in the discussion some of the very things that folks have been raising. David, I don't know if you sort of culled one or two from the chat that we haven't touched on. I think that unsurprisingly, right, folks are really concerned. I mean, yeah, the situation is as it is, right, Andrew, that Councilmember Friedson, that we're talking numbers, but we're talking people, and so folks are really concerned, even at that historical, not to keep going around the carousel on the number, right, but even at the historic level of inflation, we'd still be talking about something creeping up towards a double digit. And so I think we do have to be realistic about the market forces, but also sort of how people are living. And I know I was trying to recall early in this conversation, but I couldn't find it. I can't remember if it was during bill introduction, during the public hearing, or just something I've read in the Washington Post about the take that the real estate industry locally had, sort of when talking to you and Councilmember Fanny Gonzalez about sort of what where hard numbers need to be, because I do think not the only thing, but one of the things that I have a different take on, perhaps, that you said, is that there are folks who are definitely advocating, right, for that, for this this hard cap at the higher level, and we do want to be reasonable and make sure that folks are able to make profit, but balance, as Matt said. it's difficult. The thing I want to ask you about, though, sorry, not that, putting that aside, I will find that. I know we talked a little bit about some of the additional funding, the additional provisions in your bill and in the Home Act, right, that seek to fund rental assistance. I know we just come through a difficult budget cycle. We're probably going to have another difficult budget cycle. Noting
A
that
few thoughts on that too.
I'm sure you do. Noting, that money for rental assistance did not come down like manna from heaven from the state this time, and it may not next time, despite what some advocates, including us, were putting on the table. There's a lot of concern about sort of the potential to have some policy on the table that has a donut hole in it, that's supposed to be paying for some promised rental assistance funds to balance, right, that higher cap that's in your bill that might not be filled by some state funding. So I'm curious there, sort of what
Question. So I saw one or two questions in the chat. I'm gonna try to hit those too, and I'll be tighter on them, just try to get as many as we can. So important point. So two things. One, yes, it will not come down as manna from heaven. Hope is not a fiscal strategy, and we have been banking on hope from the federal government and the state government to essentially bail us out fiscally, and also to provide some of the support to our most vulnerable residents through this crisis. And that's gone. The music is over. The musical chairs game is happening, and there aren't enough chairs. And the county needs to grapple with those harsh realities. And these are very tough conversations that we need to be having. This year, we have actually, significantly increased rental support. And I think, that is happening. And so we bought ourselves another year of this. And in fact, my bigger concern is whether the executive branch can get the money out. We had a hearing, and there was, when Kristen Mink and I agree, that we're on to something, and I was getting like amen texts from her at certain points during a hearing that she was watching virtually, that she wasn't able to join for, but related to the fact that we shut down the rental assistance in January as a county, the executive branch did, and with the idea that it was going to run out, and it didn't. There's actually $18 million left in that account, and I said, listen, no one's here to blame anybody. This is an unprecedented situation that everybody's been asked to do, but open the applications back up yesterday. I mean, people need help now. Let's, what are we doing here? That you have the money. Let's get the money out the door. And to be honest with you, my bigger concern is whether or not we can, actually efficiently get the money to the people who need it as fast as they need it, and that is, continue to be a concern.
As we shared that concern during COVID as well. I know.
I think we're in decent shape from a funding standpoint. Ongoing, I will say, Kate Stewart deserves a lot of credit here, and as do other colleagues. I will not take the credit myself, but the recordation tax increase does include significant additional funding for rental assistance over time. So there is an additional revenue stream for rental assistance. I will say that some of that money was diverted out of this budget because we had funded it significantly. I didn't agree to that. I oppose that. So I'm going to take no credit for the first part. I'm going to take a little bit of credit for the second part, but acknowledge that colleagues put a lot of work in to that. And so there is actually some support and some help. So this isn't totally hopeless. And I just want to share that here, it's not like there's no plan and no way to address some of these issues. Will that be enough in and of itself? Probably not. But it will help to raise the baseline to make the gap for general fund dollars that we're going to need to meet the needs a lot easier to reach realistically.
Well, if I may circle back, Council Member Friedson, to your bill, and we would like to have you back on a number of conversations, but particularly on the rent relief situation and processing and opening up applications. That's a big deal for the Renters Alliance and our allies and some of these advocates. It's been a challenge for us for a while, and your expertise in this area would be very helpful. But back to your bill, the anti-rent gouging bill. Have you all considered or are reconsidering the exemption for small landlords? What is the philosophy behind a small licensed landlord not being required to stabilize their rents as opposed to larger landlords? One would assume that their rents include profit, include overhead, at the same, whether it be an individual unit or 1,000 units. Why is there an exemption for smaller landlords?
Yeah, I think there's a number of details and exemptions. Some of the exemptions we're taking from other legislation in other areas, and I think some of that will be under discussion. Obviously, we're beginning the legislative process now, but so I do think that there will be discussions about that, where everybody lands on that. We'll see. DC does exempt small landlords, from my understanding. Some jurisdictions do, some don't. And that's a discussion and decision that we will ultimately make. There are certain exemptions in one bill that aren't in the other, and vice versa. And actually, I think they're less ideological, to be honest with you, because some, if you looked at the two bills, you might say, oh, I would expect that in the other bill, and vice versa. So I do think that will be something that people do look at as we move forward. There was a question about the $30 million. I just want to differentiate. I think Richard Allen, it's good to see you, Richard, but good to at least see that you're on here, Richard, because I can't quite see you. But the $30 million was related to the minimum number that folks who supported the anti-gouging bill as part of the package wanted to see in rental assistance, and we've exceeded that number, which is good. But I think what you were referencing in the $30 million was the $100 million fund and the $50 million fund. At least based on the question that I read, the $100 million fund is the Housing Production Fund, which is a fund run through HOC, which has got national attention. It's essentially social housing. And it's a very creative way. For very nominal amount of money, we bonded it. And so for limited cost to taxpayers, we're creating thousands of units. And it's mixed income, so it's deeply affordable and affordable, but it's also market rate. The market rate helps to subsidize some of the deal to make it all work. And the benefit of that, the biggest benefit, is that it doesn't use federal tax credits, which are limited. So it allows those to be used for other affordable housing projects. They're called LIHTC, Low Income Housing Tax Credits, and HIF, Housing Initiative Fund, which is the county's main mechanism for funding it. So this has been wildly successful, and really excited about what it's going to mean for affordable housing. And as I mentioned, it will both have restricted and non-restricted units within it to create the mixed income communities that we actually really want. We're moving away from exclusively restricted units with certain income levels in them, and moving towards mixed income communities that have people at every income level living side by side in units that are indistinguishable, because we know that that's better to build community and better for educational and work and other opportunities and amenities, et cetera. And then the $50 million fund, which we're working on now, I've been working on for 3 years now. So I'm hoping to get across the finish line this calendar year, and I think we're moving in that direction. But it'll be probably start with about 20 million, but ultimately raise it to about 50 million is the long-term goal over the next few years. And it will be a fund dedicated for nonprofit housing providers. So not for-profit housing providers, nonprofit only. And it will be to build their pipelines out so they can build affordable units. And I'll note, as I did before, every single one of those buildings enter into a contract with DHCA and must follow the voluntary rent guidelines. So we are building rent restricted units, not just income restricted units, but rent restricted units, in a way that we haven't before, at a scale that we haven't before in Montgomery County. I think all of us can and should be excited about that. Doesn't solve everything, but it is a huge step in a very positive direction. So
well, we rarely go over our time, but only when we're talking about something that's as important for certainly the renter community as protecting renters from excessive rent increases that are forcing families out. A couple of nitty-gritty questions. The June 15th is the Planning, Housing and Parks Committee hearing. Will that only be on the anti-rent gouging bill, or will it consider a discussion on both bills?
Both bills. I don't expect votes to take place at that meeting, just to set expectations. We're going to do an overview and ask questions and, dive into both issues. And we thought it would be most appropriate to dive into them together.
Well, thank you. We are obviously very engaged in this issue. This is not the be-all and end-all conversation, but one of many informative conversations on the topic of both bills and rent stabilization in general. There are so many other topics on housing we'd like to discuss with you in the future, Council Member Friedson, and there are probably other questions we haven't gotten to. I know I'm going to get in trouble if I don't give a shout out to Norm Leventhal and the folks at the Grand Tenants Association. We have received your compromise suggestions. I haven't read them all yet, but everything is in the mix. Councilmember Friedson, the one thing that I'm especially pleased to hear from you is and we heard this from your colleague, Natalie Fanny Gonzalez, of the interest in compromising to reach the same goal of stable, affordable housing in Montgomery County, not just for future residents, but for the residents who live here now. And we are counting on you to pursue that with us and look forward to it. Will, any last words?
No, I just want to thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Councilmember Friedson, for making the time and for the dialogue on the issue. As you said, it's an important issue because it's about people's fundamental ability to stay in their homes, but it's also the way that we should be able to discuss important, timely policy issues. Sort of excavating them and not being afraid to disagree, but to try to find some areas.
Can I just
Yeah,
want to thank both of you. So this conversation is obviously a very emotional conversation, a very difficult conversation for very reasonable and legitimate reasons. But there have been times that it has devolved into what I think is pretty ugly at times, largely directed at a colleague of mine, at Natalie, and less directed at me. But you all have not participated in that. And I appreciate tonight's dialogue and the ongoing conversation. And I hope that you will continue to be a constructive partner in raising the discourse so that we can disagree without being disagreeable, and we can build consensus, and that we can, separate facts from feelings, legitimize the feelings, not delegitimize feelings, but focus on facts and have honest and serious and sober discussions. And you have done that here. You've done that up, prior to this. I know that you'll do that moving forward. And I just personally wanted to acknowledge that because we're in a really rough time for political and public discourse in our community, in this country, and it is discouraging and disheartening. And I just really appreciate all the efforts that you are undertaking to try to raise the discourse and really make it about the issue. So thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome, and thank you for joining us tonight. I want to thank Attorney General Anthony Brown for joining us. A real honor to have him with us, and his colleague Karen Strawn from the Attorney General's office, who's been a friend and colleague and a supporter of justice in rental housing for as long as we've known her. And of course, to my staff, to Malek Demir, Pat Beckham, and David Mullins, and to our board members, Josh Fisher, our treasurer. Councilmember Friedson, you'd like to know he is the person who makes sure that the money we receive goes where it's supposed to go. And to our vice chair, Chris Perry, and of course, the chair of our board, William Roberts. And to all of you, good night. Thank you.
Thank you all.